4 dead infants. One small town home. And a mother who lived among their hidden bodies for years. A disturbing development in western Pennsylvania has shocked investigators and the local community. Police have discovered the remains of a 4th infant inside a home where a woman was recently evicted. What started as a landlord's routine property check has unveiled what prosecutors are calling years of alleged criminal activity. This isn't the plot of a horror movie. It's a true story out of rural Pennsylvania, where investigators uncovered one of the most disturbing discoveries the state has ever seen. Inside the walls of a modest home, 4 tiny lives were found concealed in garbage bags and storage totes, their existence erased before they had a chance to begin. At the center of it all is Jessica Mothi, a 38-year-old mother of 2 living children. Outwardly, she appeared like any struggling mom. Her husband in prison, her boys just 6 and 8 years old, her life marked by hardship. But when police peeled back the layers of her private world, they revealed something that left even veteran investigators shaken. The story begins with something as ordinary as an eviction. Jessica had fallen behind on rent, relying on churches for help until her father's death cut off her last source of financial support. On August 14, 2024, she was evicted from her home in Kittanning Township, Pennsylvania. For 2 weeks, the property sat silent until the landlord returned to change the locks. What he walked into would scar him forever. The house was filthy. Trash everywhere, mattresses on the floor, cats roaming wild. But in the back of a closet, sealed inside a garbage bag, was a shape no landlord expects to see. It wasn't trash. It was the decomposed remains of a baby. He immediately called the police. And then the horror deepened. As officers combed through the property, they searched the attic. There, inside plastic storage totes, they uncovered 3 more infants. 4 in total. This raises questions so haunting they don't let you go. How did no one notice Jessica's repeated pregnancies? Were these babies born alive? And if so, what exactly happened in those final moments? Because here's the disturbing truth. Jessica herself gave investigators chilling details. She admitted to giving birth in her bathroom multiple times over 6 years. One baby, she said, was born alive, making noises until she wrapped it in a towel and waited for silence. Another, she admitted, was left in the toilet water for 15 minutes. A third, she claimed, died when she passed out on top of it. Each time, the infant was hidden away, sealed in a bag or tote, and placed in the house she shared with her 2 surviving sons. Think about that. While her children played and slept in their home, the remains of 4 of their siblings were hidden in closets in the attic, decomposing in silence. The legal system now faces its own chilling decision. Jessica is charged with homicide, manslaughter, concealing the death of a child, and abuse of a corpse. But autopsies will determine whether these infants were born alive. If they were, those charges could escalate to 4 counts of first-degree murder. And so the questions deepen. Was Jessica a desperate mother trapped in shame and secrecy, or a woman capable of calculated cruelty? Did her community fail to notice the signs, or was she simply hiding in plain sight? Stay with me, because as we unfold this case, you'll see just how fragile the line is between ordinary life and unimaginable horror. Yet even with those struggles, Jessica had a side to her that no one could ignore: her loyalty.
Friends remember her as the one who would always show up, even when it wasn't convenient. She'd stay up late talking someone through a breakup, lend money she didn't have, or cover for someone else's mistake just to keep the peace. This loyalty, this relentless need to be everything for everyone, would later define her life as a mother. But it also carried a dangerous shadow. Jessica rarely set boundaries, rarely said no, rarely put herself first. And that opened the door for others to take advantage of her kindness. When Jessica became a mother, everything changed. Like many women, she poured herself into her children with the same intensity she had always poured into others. Her identity became wrapped up in being a mother, in protecting and nurturing her kids. And if you asked her friends, they'd tell you that motherhood gave her a kind of purpose she had never quite found anywhere else. Her children were her world. But motherhood also brought new pressures. Jessica was only 38, still young, but the weight of raising children, often while juggling unstable relationships and the financial insecurity that had haunted her since childhood, left her exhausted. People like to romanticize motherhood as if love alone is enough, but the truth is harsher. Love doesn't pay rent, it doesn't heal broken trust, it doesn't erase trauma. Jessica was trying to be everything her children needed, all while carrying the heavy baggage of her own past. And that weight began to show. Her friends would later recall moments when Jessica seemed withdrawn, tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. She'd smile, she'd laugh, but there was a sadness in her eyes, a sense that she was always one step away from being overwhelmed. And yet, like so many mothers, she pushed through. She cooked meals even when she was running on empty. She went to work even when her body begged her to rest. She put her children's needs before her own, again and again, because that's what mothers do. Now, why does all of this matter? Why should we care about Jessica's childhood, her sensitivity, her struggles as a mother? Because when we talk about true crime, we often focus only on the moment of violence, the what happened. But behind every victim's name, there's a life, a history, a web of choices and circumstances that led them to that fateful moment. If we don't understand Jessica's humanity, then her tragedy becomes just another headline we scroll past, and that is an injustice. Jessica's life also forces us to confront a painful truth. Tragedy doesn't just happen to reckless people or to those who deserve it because of their choices. It happens to mothers who sacrifice daily, to women who never stop giving, to people who are simply trying to make the best of difficult circumstances. Jessica's story is a reminder that the line between ordinary life and unthinkable horror is thinner than we'd like to admit. By the time Jessica was 38, she had lived enough life to be both resilient and weary. She knew how to survive. She had been doing it since childhood. But survival is not the same thing as peace. And what makes her story so devastating is that she never got the peace she deserved. Instead, she walked into a nightmare that no one, not her, not her children, not her community, could have ever predicted. And here's where I want to pause and talk directly to you, the listener. Because it's easy, isn't it, to treat Jessica's story as just another tragic case, another dark headline. We watch, we listen, we shake our heads, maybe even cry, and then we move on with our lives. But what does that say about us? Jessica wasn't a character. She wasn't fiction. She was a real woman with real children, with real dreams. And now her story is reduced to fragments on the internet, consumed in 10-minute videos while we scroll through our feeds. So I'm asking you, no, I'm begging you, don't just consume Jessica's story. Remember her. Let it unsettle you. Let it remind you that every person you pass on the street has a history you can't see, a weight they're carrying that might be heavier than you realize. Because if we forget that, if we allow ourselves to be numb, then tragedies like Jessica's become nothing more than entertainment. And that, my friends, is the real darkness. Jessica Mothi's early life wasn't extraordinary, but it was deeply human. And that humanity is exactly why her story matters. Because in her struggles, in her sacrifices, in her relentless love for her children, we see ourselves. We see the fragility of life, and we are reminded that evil doesn't just strike in faraway places. It can find its way into the lives of ordinary mothers, ordinary families, ordinary people. People like Jessica, people like you, people like me. Evictions rarely make the news. They're painful, yes, but they're also common, an ugly reality of poverty, instability, and the harshness of systems that don't always leave room for compassion. To most people, an eviction is paperwork, a moving truck, the image of a family carrying boxes of their lives into an uncertain future. But for Jessica Mothi, her eviction became the first domino in a chain of events that would expose something darker, that no one, not her neighbors, not the authorities, not even those closest to her, could have imagined. At 38, Jessica was struggling. Financial pressures had mounted, debts piled up, and her landlord eventually made the decision to push her out. It wasn't that Jessica hadn't tried. She had fought to keep her home, fought to give her children stability. But sometimes, no matter how hard you fight, the weight of life's circumstances tips the scales against you. And on that day, when the sheriff's deputy came to enforce the eviction, Jessica's private struggle suddenly became a public one. Neighbors watched as Jessica and her children stood by helplessly while the life they had built inside those four walls was dismantled in front of them. Furniture hauled out, belongings piled on the curb, the quiet humiliation of losing not just a house, but a sense of safety. And while eviction is traumatic enough, what came next is what turned this case into something altogether different. Because when officials began the process of clearing the home, they made a discovery that no one was prepared for. Behind the ordinary clutter of family life, toys, clothes stacked in boxes, there was something deeply disturbing. Tucked away where no one expected it, authorities uncovered evidence that pointed to a far darker reality Jessica had been living. The discovery wasn't just shocking, it was horrifying. It suggested that Jessica's struggles hadn't been limited to money, relationships, or the daily hardships of motherhood. Something sinister had been festering in the shadows of her life, hidden even from those who thought they knew her best. The first whispers among the eviction crew were that something wasn't right. Items were found that didn't belong, signs of neglect or danger that made even hardened officials pause. What started as a routine enforcement of the law suddenly transformed into an active investigation. And Jessica, who just moments ago was being treated as another struggling tenant, was now the center of something far darker. Think about that for a moment. Imagine the humiliation of eviction, the eyes of your neighbors on you, your children crying, your belongings scattered on the ground. And then as all of this unfolds, a discovery is made that doesn't just change your day, it changes your identity. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the community, in the eyes of the nation, you are no longer just a mother fighting to survive. You are the subject of suspicion, the face of a chilling mystery. The discovery raised questions that would haunt everyone who followed the case. How long had this been going on? Who else knew? Could someone have stepped in sooner, prevented what came next? These questions weren't just logistical, they were moral, and they exposed a painful truth about how often society overlooks the vulnerable until it's far too late. For the investigators, this was no longer about an eviction. It was about uncovering the hidden layers of Jessica's life. They began to dig deeper, interviewing neighbors, combing through her past, trying to piece together the story of how a 38-year-old mother, who outwardly seemed like so many others, ended up here, her private pain spilling into public horror. And here's the part that unsettles me the most, and maybe it will unsettle you too. This wasn't a discovery made in a faraway place, in some unfamiliar world. It happened in a neighborhood like yours, on a street like yours. Jessica wasn't a stranger to her community. She wasn't invisible. People saw her every day, passed her in the store, nodded at her as she walked her children to school. And yet, no one saw this coming. Now, I want you to think about this. How many times have you walked past someone struggling and thought nothing of it? How many times have you shrugged and said, "That's not my business"? Jessica's story is a reminder that behind closed doors, behind the facades we all present, there can be entire worlds of suffering, danger, and desperation that we fail to see or choose not to. As the investigation deepened, the shocking discovery inside Jessica's home began to reshape the narrative. This wasn't just about poverty or eviction anymore. It was about secrets. And secrets, when dragged into the light, rarely come quietly. They scream. They force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the people we think we know best are carrying darkness we can't begin to imagine. Jessica's eviction could have been the end of her story, a sad tale of a struggling mother losing her home. But the discovery ensured that it was only the beginning. From that moment on, the world would no longer see Jessica as just a mother. She would become a symbol, a question mark, a cautionary tale of how quickly life can unravel when hidden truths finally surface. And here's where I want to pause and speak to you directly again. It's easy to treat Jessica's eviction as just another detail in a true crime case, but I want you to sit with it. Imagine being in her shoes. Imagine your children watching as strangers toss your life into the street. Imagine the shame, the fear, the uncertainty of not knowing where you'll sleep that night. Now add to that the weight of secrets being ripped open, exposed in front of everyone. This isn't just tragedy, it's devastation. And yet, most of us will listen to this, feel a flicker of pity, and then move on.
But here's the guilt I want to lay on you. What if the next Jessica is someone in your life? A neighbor.
House itself told a story of neglect and secrecy. Investigators reported that the environment was unlivable. Filth clung to every surface, trash was piled high, and food was left to rot. But the most disturbing element wasn't the mess, it was the silence. The eerie stillness of rooms where innocent lives ended. Neighbors later admitted they had smelled something strange at times, but chalked it up to garbage or poor sanitation. Nobody ever imagined that what they were smelling was death itself. And that's the part that should make us all pause. How often do we dismiss signs because they seem too uncomfortable to consider? How often do we turn away, convincing ourselves it's not our business? The eviction changed everything. The landlord, who had already struggled to collect rent from Jessica, was simply trying to reclaim their property. They had no idea their legal action would uncover one of the darkest cases Pennsylvania had seen in years. Imagine being that landlord, expecting to find a dirty but empty house, and instead discovering the hidden remains of children. Trauma like that doesn't leave a person. It stays, replaying every time they close their eyes. And then there's the community. Kittanning Township isn't a bustling city. It's a small place where people wave to each other at stoplights, where neighbors nod as they mow their lawns. The revelation that a mother had been living among them with the bodies of infants hidden inside her home was almost too much to bear. Some neighbors felt sick. Others felt guilty, wondering if they should have asked more questions, pressed harder when they noticed the odd smell, the withdrawn behavior. But hindsight is cruel. In the moment, nobody wants to believe their neighbor is capable of something like this. Police immediately launched a full investigation. Jessica was charged with multiple counts, including abuse of a corpse. But here's the chilling reality. Abuse of a corpse is only the beginning. If the autopsies reveal that even one of those babies took a breath, Jessica could face charges of homicide. And if that's the case, she won't just be remembered as a neglectful mother who hid her pain. She'll be remembered as a killer. The question everyone now asks is why? Why keep the bodies? Was it denial? The desperate act of a woman who couldn't accept reality? Was it fear of the law, or of losing her other children if authorities knew she had more pregnancies? Or was it something darker, something rooted in cruelty or apathy, or the belief that nobody would ever find out? These are questions we may never get clear answers to, because Jessica herself seems unwilling or unable to truly explain. But let's not lose sight of the most heartbreaking detail here. These were children. Children who never got a chance to live, laugh, cry, or even be held properly. Their lives ended before they began. And then their tiny bodies were hidden away like shameful secrets. And for years, nobody knew. And here's where I need to turn to you, the viewer. Because it's easy to shake our heads at this story, to distance ourselves from it, to call Jessica a monster and move on, but ask yourself this: what would you have done if you were her neighbor? Would you have noticed the smell and asked questions? Would you have reported it? Or would you have turned away, deciding it wasn't your problem? It's uncomfortable to admit, but most of us avoid confrontation. And in that avoidance, tragedies like this are allowed to fester. So I'll ask you directly, how many lives are lost simply because we don't want to get involved? All right, this is where we hit the heaviest and darkest section of Jessica Mothy's story, her chilling confession. This is the heart of the script, and it needs to be both detailed and immersive, capturing not just what she said, but the psychological weight, the investigators' reactions, and the moral questions that linger in the air. When investigators sat across from Jessica Mothy for the first time, they expected denial. They expected tears, excuses, or even silence. What they didn't expect was calmness. A strange, almost detached honesty that sent chills through the room. Here was a 38-year-old mother, her 2 surviving sons in protective custody, her home sealed off like a crime scene, and she was about to confess to something almost too horrific to put into words. Jessica began by admitting what had been suspected since the bodies were found. She had given birth multiple times between 2017 and 2023. Not once, not twice, but at least 3 separate times. Each time, she claimed, the infants were stillborn. According to her, none of them ever cried, never opened their eyes, never took a single breath of air. She described these births almost clinically, as though she were reciting a medical record instead of recounting the loss of children. For investigators, this detail immediately raised alarms. They had seen too many cases where stillbirth was used as a cover, where parents claimed babies were born lifeless when in reality, the truth was far darker. And so as Jessica continued, detectives scribbled notes furiously, trying to capture every word, every pause, every inconsistency. She said the first baby came in 2017, alone, without medical care, in her own home. According to Jessica, she went into labor unexpectedly and delivered by herself. The infant, she claimed, never showed signs of life. She admitted she didn't seek help, didn't call emergency services, didn't even attempt CPR. Instead, she wrapped the small body in a cloth, placed it inside a box, and hid it. That baby would remain there, silent and forgotten, as life in the house carried on. But it didn't stop there. In 2018 or 2019, Jessica said, it happened again. Another pregnancy, another labor, another stillbirth, or so she claimed. And again, the same haunting pattern. Instead of burying the child or notifying anyone, she kept the body, this time tucked away in the attic crawl space where no one ever ventured. The third baby came years later, sometime around 2023. Once again, Jessica insisted that the baby was lifeless at birth. And once again, she concealed the body. 3 children, born into silence, hidden away as if they were mistakes instead of human lives. As Jessica spoke, the detectives felt an eerie tension building in the room. On one hand, she seemed cooperative. On the other, her tone was chillingly casual, as if she were describing routine chores instead of the deaths of her own children. Investigators asked her the same question repeatedly. Were you absolutely certain these babies were dead? Jessica's response never changed. They weren't alive when they were born. But the truth isn't that simple. Forensic science would need to determine if these were truly stillbirths or if Jessica's inaction, or worse, deliberate action, caused their deaths. And that's where her story began to crumble. Medical experts know that stillbirths happen, yes. But for 3 stillbirths to occur in such a short span of years, all under similar circumstances and all kept hidden, that's statistically rare, almost impossibly rare. If Jessica truly experienced such tragedies, why didn't she seek medical help at least once? Why not go to a hospital, call an ambulance, confide in a family member? Instead, she chose silence and concealment. One detective later described her as eerily unemotional. Another said it was like listening to someone talk about throwing away trash. And perhaps that's what disturbed people most, the lack of visible grief. She wasn't sobbing, she wasn't breaking down. She was flat, almost rehearsed. And in that flatness, suspicion grew. Autopsies were ordered immediately. Each tiny set of remains was carefully transported to the medical examiner's office, where experts would attempt to answer the impossible question: did these children ever live? This process, grim as it is, involves checking the lungs for signs of oxygen. If a baby takes even one breath, microscopic changes occur in the tissue. And if those changes are found, Jessica's story falls apart. Meanwhile, as investigators pushed Jessica for more details, a disturbing picture of secrecy and neglect emerged. She admitted that during each of these pregnancies, she told no one. Not Jacob, the father of her 2 surviving sons, not her neighbors, not her family. She carried life inside her, gave birth in silence, and then erased the evidence as if nothing had happened. The surviving children added another layer to this tragedy. For years, they lived in the same home as their deceased siblings. They ate dinner at the table, played video games, went to school, all while hidden nearby were the bodies of babies they never knew existed. Imagine growing up in an environment where death was literally part of the walls, and no one told you. Those boys will one day learn the truth, and that knowledge may scar them more than the neglect they already endured.
For many, the most disturbing part of Jessica's confession wasn't just the concealment, but the possibility of intent. Did she choose not to seek help because she didn't want more children? Was it fear of poverty, fear of losing the one she already had, fear of authorities stepping in? Or was it something darker, something rooted in apathy or resentment, her cruelty? These are questions investigators, psychologists, and the public continue to wrestle with. Neighbors who once waved at Jessica in passing were horrified. They recalled her as quiet, withdrawn, sometimes unfriendly, but never someone they suspected of harboring such dark secrets. A few admitted that the house always had a strange smell, but they brushed it off as poor housekeeping. And here's where the guilt sets in. How many people suspected something was wrong, but said nothing? Jessica's case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about society's blind spots. We assume mothers will seek help if they're in crisis. We assume neighbors will intervene if they sense something off. We assume tragedies like this don't happen in our communities. But they do. They happen in silence, behind closed doors, hidden in attics and boxes, until they're uncovered by chance. And here's the most haunting thought. If Jessica hadn't been evicted, would anyone have ever known? Would those infants have remained hidden forever? Their existence erased, their tiny lives unacknowledged? That possibility chills me more than anything else.
The confession marked a turning point in the investigation. Jessica was no longer just a struggling mother in poverty, she was a suspect in a potential series of infant deaths. Every word she spoke was scrutinized, every inconsistency magnified. And as the autopsies loomed, the weight of her calm voice echoed, "They weren't alive when they were born." But what if they were? What if one of those babies had taken a single breath, even a single gasp, before being silenced forever? That single moment changes everything. It changes Jessica from a negligent mother into something far worse, a murderer. And this is where I have to stop and turn the mirror back on us. Because while it's easy to demonize Jessica, the truth is far more complicated. Yes, she made choices. Horrifying, unforgivable choices. But what about the systems that failed? What about the neighbors who turned away, the lack of medical oversight, the absence of support? How many cracks in the system allowed this to go on for years? So here's my challenge to you, watching this right now. How many times have you noticed something off, something unsettling, and told yourself it wasn't your business? How many times have you avoided asking a hard question because you didn't want to be nosy? Because Jessica's case isn't just about one mother's monstrous decisions. It's about a community that looked the other way. And maybe, just maybe, that's the darkest pattern of all. This part of the story is equally haunting, because while investigators uncovered the remains of 3 infants, 2 children were still alive. Children who had been raised in that very same house, surrounded by secrets, neglect, and the silent presence of their deceased siblings. When authorities entered Jessica Mothi's home after her eviction, the sight that greeted them was a nightmare. But amid the filth, the stench, and the unthinkable discoveries, there was another, almost surreal realization. Children had been living here. 2 boys, Jessica's surviving sons, had grown up in this environment. And the question that still hangs over this case is simple but horrifying. What does it do to a child to grow up in a home where death is hidden in the walls? Imagine being 8 years old, or maybe 10, playing video games in the living room, eating dinner at the table, sleeping in your bed at night, while in the attic above you, wrapped in silence and cloth, lies the body of your sibling. Imagine never knowing they existed, never being told your mother had been pregnant again, never even noticing the smell because it was just normal. That was life for Jessica's children. Neighbors, when interviewed, admitted that the boys always seemed quiet, reserved, not withdrawn enough to draw alarm, but different. And now, in hindsight, how could they not be? Living in that environment, a home filled with neglect, tension, and secrets, must have left scars deeper than anyone can see. Investigators reported that the house was in such poor condition that it was barely livable. Trash was piled high, food was left to rot, surfaces were stained with dirt and grime. For adults, it was unbearable. For children, it was normal. They didn't know any different. Their world was shaped by Jessica's silence, by her choices, by the invisible weight of the siblings they never met. And here's where the true horror sets in. These boys were survivors, but survival came at a cost. Psychologists who work in cases like this say that children raised in neglectful or secretive environments often carry invisible trauma. Even if they didn't know the full truth, even if they never stumbled upon the boxes or the attic crawl space, their nervous systems would have picked up on the tension, the unspoken weight in the house, the feeling that something wasn't right. One expert described it this way: children are like sponges. They absorb not just words, but moods, silences, the energy of the home. You can't hide despair from them, even if you never speak it aloud. That means Jessica's sons likely carried that despair inside them even before they could name it. It's impossible not to think of the moment when they will learn the full truth, because eventually they will. They'll Google their mother's name, they'll see the headlines, they'll learn that the smell in the house wasn't trash, it was death, and that realization will fracture something deep inside them. The ripple effects don't stop there. Children who grow up in homes of neglect often struggle with trust, self-worth, and relationships. Some fall into cycles of self-destruction. Others spend years in therapy, trying to rebuild a sense of safety that was stolen from them before they even understood what safety meant. These boys didn't just lose siblings, they lost innocence. And here's the cruelest part. None of this was their fault. They didn't ask for this life. They didn't choose their mother's silence, her secrecy, her decisions. They were just children, trying to exist in a world that was stacked against them. Yet they will bear the consequences of Jessica's choices for the rest of their lives. This is where we have to pause again and look at ourselves. Because cases like Jessica Mothi's don't just happen in isolation. They happen in silence, in communities where neighbors see but don't ask, where children suffer quietly because no one wants to get involved. These boys were surrounded by adults, neighbors, teachers, landlords, and yet nobody knew the truth until it was too late. How many times do children like them slip through the cracks, their pain unnoticed until it explodes into headlines? And so I have to ask you, if you saw children living in a house that looked neglected, smelled wrong, felt off, would you say something? Would you intervene? Or would you look away, telling yourself it wasn't your business? Because those choices matter. Those silences matter. Jessica's sons are now in a new chapter of their lives, but the trauma of their childhood will follow them. They will need therapy, stability, love, and above all, truth. They will need people willing to sit with them in the darkness of their past and remind them that their future doesn't have to be defined by it. But even then, some scars never fully heal. So as we think about them, let's not just focus on Jessica's crime. Let's focus on the cost. The cost to children who deserved better. The cost to a community that failed to see. The cost to innocence itself. And let it challenge us, because the next child living in silence might be closer than we think. And now I want to turn the question directly to you. What responsibility do we carry for the children around us? Because if Jessica's boys had been your neighbors, your students, your relatives, would you have noticed? Would you have acted? Or would you have walked by blind to the dark patterns forming right in front of you? When authorities first stepped into Jessica Mothi's house, they thought they were walking into just another eviction cleanup. Trash, filth, neglect, the usual marks of a tenant who had given up. But within hours, that assumption collapsed. What they found wasn't just evidence of poverty or depression, it was evidence of death. And suddenly, the entire case shifted from routine eviction to criminal investigation. 3 sets of remains, 3 infants, hidden, not buried, stored inside a home still filled with life, Jessica's surviving children. And with that discovery came the question that prosecutors and investigators are still wrestling with today. What exactly is Jessica Mothi guilty of? At first, the charges seemed almost mundane compared to the horror of the crime. Prosecutors in Minnesota filed felony counts of concealment of a body. That's it. Not murder, not manslaughter, just concealment. On paper, it looks so small, almost dismissive. But here's where the system shows its cracks, because to prove murder, you need evidence. And with infants this young, evidence is fragile, fleeting, often impossible to secure. The autopsies told investigators what they feared. The babies were full term, they were born alive. But how they died, that answer was far murkier. No stab wounds, no strangulation marks, no blunt force trauma. In cases of infant death, the cause can vanish with time. Suffocation leaves no clear fingerprint. Neglect,
can't always be proven under a microscope, and without certainty, prosecutors are left with only shadows. And yet, let's be honest, does anyone believe these were natural deaths? 3 infants, hidden, wrapped, left to decompose in silence. A mother who told no one, sought no medical help, reported no pregnancies. If it were just 1, maybe doubt could survive. But 3? 3 crosses a line. 3 demands explanation. Still, the courtroom does not run on suspicion. It runs on evidence. And so the system moves carefully, maybe too carefully. Jessica was booked, charged with concealment, and held on bail. But in the background, detectives continued digging. Forensic experts combed through the home. Prosecutors waited on toxicology. And the public waited too. Frustrated, angry, asking how something this horrific could amount to nothing more than a concealment charge. This is where the investigation takes on a second layer. Not just what happened to the infants, but who failed to stop it from happening. Because Jessica wasn't living in a remote cabin in the woods. She was in a rental home, in a neighborhood, surrounded by neighbors, paying rent to a landlord who eventually kicked her out. For years, people walked past that house. For years, children played in that yard. For years, teachers saw her surviving sons come to school, and no one ever knew what secrets lay upstairs. The legal system now has to answer 2 questions at once. What crime, if any, did Jessica commit against her infants? And what responsibility does society hold for letting it go unnoticed for so long? Prosecutors, of course, focus on the first. If toxicology reveals drugs in the infant systems, the charges could escalate. If forensic pathology proves suffocation, that's homicide. But every day that passes without clear evidence makes the case harder. Time is the enemy of truth. Decomposition erases answers. Silence covers tracks. Meanwhile, Jessica's defense will almost certainly argue mental health, depression, postpartum psychosis, desperation. They'll say she was overwhelmed, unsupported, and unable to cope. They'll try to paint her not as a monster, but as a mother lost in darkness. And in the eyes of the law, that matters. Because proving intent, that she meant to kill, that she chose to kill, is a steep mountain to climb. But let's pause here and step back from the courtroom. Because whether or not prosecutors prove murder, the moral weight doesn't vanish. Jessica carried children inside her. She gave birth. She made choices in silence, and 3 tiny lives ended before they even began. No charge can erase that truth. No defense can soften it. And yet, here comes the part that stings. Cases like this rarely end the way we think they should. Often, mothers in these situations are convicted not of murder, but of concealment or neglect. They serve reduced sentences. They walk free in years, not decades. And the public is left with a bitter taste. Was justice really served? That's why investigators are moving cautiously. They know the public is watching. They know every decision will be scrutinized. And they know that if they overcharge and fail to prove murder, Jessica could walk away with almost nothing. So instead, they're building slowly, testing, waiting, hoping the evidence speaks clearly enough to hold up in court. But here's the question we have to ask ourselves. Why does it take 3 infants for us to notice? Why does it take discovery at eviction for society to act? Jessica didn't get here overnight. The signs were there. The isolation, the neglect, the silence. But nobody asked. Nobody intervened. And so this investigation isn't just about one woman, it's about us. About neighbors who turn away, about systems that fail to catch mothers in crisis before it's too late, and about the dark patterns of silence that allow horror to grow in ordinary houses on ordinary streets until the day the truth is too loud to ignore. Legally, Jessica Mothi stands accused of concealment, but morally, she stands as a mirror
a reminder of what happens when despair festers unseen, a warning that justice doesn't always mean closure. And as we watch this case unfold, the question isn't just what punishment Jessica deserves. The real question is, what responsibility do we share for letting it happen at all?
When the coroner's office began the painstaking process of examining the 3 small bodies found in Jessica Mathi's home, there was already a grim understanding. Time had not been kind to the truth. Infant remains are delicate, fragile, and after weeks or months, sometimes years of concealment, evidence dissolves. What the medical examiners were tasked with was not just science, but almost a form of archaeology. They were trying to reconstruct a story from fragments, to find voices in silence. The first reports indicated that the infants were born alive. This is the haunting detail that cannot be ignored. These were not stillbirths, they were not miscarriages. They were children who had taken their first breaths, however brief. But the question remained, how did those breaths stop? And here is where the limits of forensic science collide with the demands of justice. In cases of suffocation, for example, there may be no telltale signs, no broken bones, no bruises, just silence. In cases of neglect, malnutrition, or exposure, the evidence can fade with decomposition. Toxicology may sometimes uncover drugs, but that is not guaranteed. And without a definitive cause of death, prosecutors face a wall. Suspicion is not conviction. It is here that many true crime stories take a devastating turn, because the public expects murder charges, expects justice, expects a courtroom showdown that matches the horror of the crime. But the reality is colder. If cause of death cannot be proved, if intent cannot be demonstrated, then the law often shrinks the crime into something less. And so Jessica Mathi, even with 3 infants found in her home, faces charges of concealment, not homicide. The community's reaction was as predictable as it was visceral. Neighbors who once waved politely now spoke with outrage. "We smelled things," some said. "We thought maybe it was garbage." Others recalled seeing Jessica gain weight and then suddenly slim down without ever seeing a baby in her arms. There were whispers of denial. How could we have not known? But beneath the whispers was guilt, a gnawing sense that they had failed to see, failed to act. And here lies one of the darkest truths. Horror like this does not grow in a vacuum. It grows in silence, in neglect, in the spaces where community turns its head. What drove Jessica? This is the question that hangs like smoke over the case. Was it postpartum depression? Was it psychosis? Was it desperation? Some point to her financial situation, others to her isolation, still others to something colder, a deliberate attempt to rid herself of unwanted children. And perhaps the truth lies in a tangled web of all these factors, but whatever the reason, the fact remains 3 lives ended before they began, and Jessica lived among them, in the same house, as if they were not there. This is what unsettled investigators most, not just the deaths, but the concealment. To live with those bodies, to walk past them daily, to tuck your surviving children into bed knowing what lay in the next room. That is not just desperation, it is compartmentalization at a level most of us cannot comprehend. Psychologists call it dissociation, a way of walling off unbearable truths. Forensic science may never prove exactly how those infants died. The courts may never deliver a sentence that feels proportionate. But Jessica's house was not just a crime scene. It was a mirror. It showed us what happens when despair hides behind closed doors and no one dares to knock. It showed us the price of isolation in a world that prides itself on community. It showed us how easy it is to look away until the day we cannot. So where does this leave us? With responsibility. Not just to shake our heads at Jessica, but to open our eyes to the Jessicas who are still out there. To mothers in crisis, unseen. To families falling apart behind curtains we never draw back. Because the truth is harsh. If we keep looking away, we will keep finding bodies. And by then, it will always be too late. Jessica Mothy may carry the legal blame, but the moral weight belongs to all of us. And the next time you see a neighbor struggling, the next time you hear cries muffled by thin walls, the next time you sense something is not right, ask yourself this: will you act or will you turn away? Because every silence we keep writes the next chapter in stories like this. If you've made it this far, don't just leave shaken, leave changed. Share Jessica's story, not to sensationalize, but to warn, to remind others that neglect thrives in silence. And if you want to be part of stopping the next Jessica Mothy, then take one simple step. Pay attention. Care enough to notice. Care enough to ask. Care enough to act. Because sometimes the difference between life and death is not in the courtroom, not in the autopsy, but in a neighbor who refuses to stay silent.